Hello and good evening, everybody. I'm glad to welcome you to this Athena lecture at the Department of Architecture in 2021. We are doing this as an online event, also as a part of the Parity Talks. And this event will be recorded for those who cannot fully take part today. My name is Marie Glaser, and I'm directing the Center for Research on Architecture, Society, and the Built Environment here at the LUS, which is the Institute for Landscape and Urban Studies at the Department of Architecture at ETH Zurich. I am a cultural anthropologist myself, working with architects at the Department of Architecture for quite a while. Today, the Athena lecture will be held by our guest, by the New York-based architecture and design critic, Alexandra Lange. Welcome, Alexandra. It's great to have you here and giving your lecture in the context of these Parity Talks. Hi.
Hi.
You are our second guest in this series after the lecture last October of Marwa Al-Sabuni. So we will have a continuation of these talks, and I'm very happy to have you as the second female excellent scholar with us. You will critically examine the setting of role models in architecture in your lecture, which is titled Looking for Role Models in All the Wrong Places. But maybe before, as an intro, let me tell you quickly about the genealogy and the format of the Athena lectures here at the DR. During visits of colleagues at universities in the UK, but also in Stockholm at KTH, we had the chance to listen to and become acquainted with this format of formidable women scholars giving a lecture on their work and engaging then in a conversation with students and faculty on multiple issues of experiences in working in the professional field or teaching at school, so expertise and experiences. Inspired by this practice of networking and teaching, 2 years ago, our team at ETH Case, ETH Wohnforum, we proposed to bring this format of an Athena lecture also to our department to enrich the teaching here. And the proposal was successfully taken forward. We collaborate with the Parity Group since that moment. And we would like to thank, of course, the Office of the President of ETH and the DR for their support. And we thank also Athena, the goddess of wisdom. In the coming years, we can organize a series of lectures by women designers and scholars in the field of urban studies, architecture, urban design, planning, and landscape studies. This Athena lecture series gives students, foremost, and faculty an opportunity to engage in a discussion with leading senior and junior faculty, which are scientists, architects, and professionals. Our aim is, by bringing the brightest minds and the most engaging speakers, critical thinkers, influential thinkers to ETH Hönkelberg, we aim to encourage critical thinking, conversations, and the genesis of ideas here at our place. Our invited guests present her scholarly and creative research in a public lecture. And then this is followed by an open Q&A session where there is opportunity for all audiences to further engage with the lecturer. Today, I'm glad to have two colleagues from the architecture department with me in conversation with Alexandra. This is Elena Chiavi and Julien Lafontaine Carboni. I will introduce them shortly right before they take over the word after the lecture of Alexandra. In fall 2019, instead of putting up a list of speakers ourselves for this lecture series, we organized an open voting for all students and faculty to nominate their most preferred candidates for these lectures here. Alexandra received a huge lot of votes, so we contacted her and she was very pleased to hear that students and faculty of the ARC at ETH selected her as one of the speakers of the lectures, and she accepted. Alexandra is living and working in New York as a design critic. She studied in Yale, and she holds a PhD from New York University and has been Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She won a 2018 New York Press Club Award for feature reporting internet for her Curb story on teens and public space. A year later, she was awarded a Stephen Heller Prize for cultural commentary by AEGA. And last year, Alexandra was the recipient of the Stephen A. Clement Oculus Award from AEA New York, given to architectural journalists. She also was awarded the 2020 Brio Prize by the Swedish toy company, you know, maybe those of you who have kids know them. And this prize honors researchers and nonprofits focused on creating a better world through play. Her essays, reviews, and profiles have appeared in numerous design publications, including Architect, Harvard Design Magazine, Metropolis, and T Magazine, also The Atlantic, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. She has been a featured writer at Design Observer, an opinion columnist at Design, and the architecture critic for Curb. She has taught criticism at the School of Visual Arts and New York University. Of course, she is also author of many books, but just to name in specific, her book, Writing About Architecture, Mastering the Language of Buildings and Cities, is a primer on how to read and write architecture criticism. She has lectured widely at universities, museum, and design conferences in international contexts. What I appreciate very highly is Alexandra's approach of reflecting on the relation of architecture, the position of criticism, and a feminist perspective, which she's sharing with us today. Your writing, and this is just a sneak preview, and then I give the word to you. The idea that architecture is created by a single individual has long been a fiction, perpetuated by the media as well as design history. For many years, I sought female role models that fit that same heroic pattern, beginning with Ada Louise Huxtable, the only women architecture critic I could see. More recently, however, I realized that this quest perpetuated the same fiction of the individual going it alone. For criticism to reflect architecture as it really is, and for architecture to reflect society as it really is, the quest should not be for a role model, but for a chorus. So this for me is reason enough now to give the word to you and hear more about that. Please take the word. Thank you for being with us, Alexandra.
Thanks so much for having me. That was a very generous introduction. And it sounds like you all really have put together a wonderful couple of days of talks. And I caught just the end of the previous session and seeing that you had set up ways, students had set up ways to kind of contain the knowledge and move it forward from everything that you guys have shared today is just a great symbol, because, you know, everything that we learn, we have to share. And now there are so many tools to make it easy for people to learn and contribute to these group efforts. So I'm going to give a talk and then I'm going to answer questions. I'm going to share my screen now because I have slides with many pictures of women architecture critics for you guys to look at. Let's see. Is that working? Yeah, okay, great. So looking for role models in all the wrong places. I love this photo. This is an image from 1970 of Ada Louise Huxtable with her boss, New York Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger. He's announcing to the New York Times newsroom that she has won the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism. He's talking, she's listening, he's gesturing, she's still, I think she's waiting for her moment. So this image has long been an inspiration to me, but it looks very different to me now than it did at the beginning of my career. Then it served as a beacon. If I was very smart and very talented and very lucky, maybe that could be me one day. But now I have more questions about it than I have answers. Should I or should you wait to be crowned by a legacy institution? Should we seek recognition as singular talents? Should we wait our turn? Should we only be inspired by people who have succeeded rather than those to whose success we might be able to contribute? So as more and more stories reveal, these legacy institutions aren't always the best judge of what is good. Architecture and design are not often the work of one person, and waiting for recognition may mean putting off for tomorrow what you can do today. So my lecture today is sort of a travelogue, moving through my own work as it intersects with ideas about representation, recognition, and collaboration. And I hope that it will give you a bibliography of possibilities, but also ideas about how you can also contribute to that bibliography. So by the time Ada Louise Huxtable won the Pulitzer Prize, she had been the New York Times architecture critic for 7 years, the first full-time newspaper critic in the United States. Her readers had become accustomed, after the politicians had their say, after the developers had their say, after the architects had their say, to hearing what Ada Louise Huxtable had to say. She didn't need to be the first or the loudest or the longest-winded critic. Writing for establishment platforms like the New York Times and later the Wall Street Journal took care of much of that. But I imagine her waiting and watching, that same bemused smile on her face, as other people talked themselves into a corner, and then it was time for her to bring down the hammer. This was a great cartoon published in the New Yorker in 1968 that shows just how outsized her reputation had become. I doubt that I would have become an architecture critic if I had not seen her face. When I was in high school and college in the 1990s, Ada Louise Huxtable was the architecture critic. She had already been working at the New York Times for 30 years. She'd written 2 of the best titled books of architecture criticism ever, with titles that I think anticipate the internet's love of rhetorical questions. Sometimes I like to imagine if someone were adopting this style of book title today, what they could call their books. How will they water the plants on the 44th floor, or texted a building lately? But today, they're far more visible representation than one bemused woman. Children's shelves teem with board books, picture books, girls' magazines, thick compendiums of kick-ass women in design and politics and art and space. There's a children's book about Zaha Hadid. There's a children's book about Jane Jacobs. You can't be what you can't see, said Marion Wright Edelman, speaking more generally about the lack of diversity in children's literature. And these books are one form of response. And yet I've found that my own children don't like these books. Many children don't read them more than once. They're a symbol of good intentions, but they find them didactic and lacking in the uncertainty that gives narratives power. They want to read about the real process of coming into your creative self, not the cleaned up version without the tears and false starts and bad bosses edited out. That said, when a children needs to find a photo of someone successful that looks like them, it's far easier to find now than it was in the 1990s. But my kids, at least, would rather find a fictional girl to kick ass, as in the films of Hayao Miyazaki, you see Kiki's Delivery Service here, or in the graphic novels of George O'Connor, than to be told after the fact about a woman who's already labeled a game changer. They don't want to just replace hero worship with heroine worship. And that's smart, because by the time I grew up and became an architecture critic myself, I realized that the Ada Louise Huxtable image I loved had lied to me a bit. And those board book success stories lie a little bit too. Yes, there was a female architecture critic, but all around her, mentored by the very people with whom I was taking classes at Yale, being published in magazines and newspapers, were many, many more male architecture critics. It was possible for me to become a working architecture critic, but was it probable? It was also not lost on me that all of the critics pictured here are white. The demographics of the architecture profession are reflected and even magnified in the much tinier and even more embattled profession of architecture criticism. So Ada Louise Huxtable's prominence distracted me from her unicorn-like status. By the time I got a job in journalism in New York in my 20s, the reality became clear. All of my bosses were men, and I needed a role model who looked more like me. I decided, in fact, to make one up. Ada Louise Huxtable as a real person might not have liked many buildings, but as a fictional avatar, I never met her till much later in my career, I decided that she would like me. I created a narrative behind her Mona Lisa smile to give myself the mentor that I needed to succeed. And in doing so, I made up the details of a book that's yet to be written. Until fairly recently, if you looked up architecture critic in Wikipedia, you didn't see Ada Louise Huxtable. In fact, you saw no women at all. And this wasn't all that surprising. In 2015, only 15% of the biographies on Wikipedia were about women. That number is now up to about 18%. And since then, a number of museums and universities have organized edit-a-thons with long lists of women in art, architecture, and design who need to be added. There are also separate initiatives designed to fill in the digital knowledge gap, like this one, the Pioneering Women of Architecture site, sponsored by the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, that also seeks to expand who turns up when you are looking up, say, famous mid-century modern architects. Other projects with similar goals include Jerome Harris's project As Not For on Black graphic designers, or the brand new online course, Black Design in America, created by Silas Monroe of Polymode with numerous collaborators. There was also a Curve series on, quote, the modernist next door, which uncovered many, many regional architects, including a number of women, people of color, and women of color who did lower profile commercial and residential work that has probably touched more lives than the famous skyscrapers. Getting people to volunteer their time to write women into Wikipedia is only part of the battle. Wikipedia entries are constantly being rejected for lack of notability, but notability often means, at least in the US, covered by the New York Times. And everyone other than white men has long been undercovered in the papers of record. Look at the project of the New York Times ongoing series Overlooked, which writes way posthumous obituaries for people that the paper missed the first time around. I wrote this one in 2019 for Julia Morgan, 60 years after her death and 5 years after she won the AIA Gold Medal. My first reaction when they emailed me to ask me to write it was, wow, that's a pretty big career to overlook. Julia Morgan was, by most definitions, America's first female architect. She was the first woman graduate of the School of Beaux-Arts. She was the first woman licensed in California. And she was also the architect of one of the most popular house museums in the country, Hearst Castle. You can chalk her omission partially up to East Coast bias, but still. The same power structures associated with legacy institutions are remaking themselves in new digital institutions like Wikipedia. And the only way to overcome these structures is to write these new narratives. Me turning Ada Louise Huxtable into my imaginary mentor, legions of digital natives writing women into Wikipedia, and as I've realized going forward in my career as a critic, writing history from the edge rather than from the center. That often means writing history about so-called silly forms of architecture like playgrounds or shopping malls, but also writing history about collaborative rather than singular talents. I myself was added to Wikipedia in 2019, so that now when you search architecture criticism, I do turn up in that list of critics. But until last week, there was a note that you can see here at the top of the page. Despite me checking so many institutional boxes, an Ivy League education, an Ivy League fellowship, publication in the New York Times, it was still a problem for Wikipedia editors that other people weren't writing me up. My entry lacks secondary and tertiary sources, and it's only thanks to a Wikipedia edit-a-thon in Australia that now that note has been removed from my biography. Ada Louise Huxtable wasn't even the first American woman architecture. Before there was a licensed woman architect, there was a woman architecture critic. In America Builds, an essential source book of turn-of-the-century architecture writings, Leland Roth notes that it was in the late 19th century that art and architecture criticism first emerged in the United States, and that the first critics were Henry Van Brunt, Russell Sturgis, and a woman named Mariana Griswold van Rensselaer. In reading and rereading the work of a group of critics that I've come to see as the founding mothers, Mariana van Rensselaer, Esther McCoy, Jane Jacobs, and Ada Louise Huxtable, in order of oldest to youngest, I've been struck by what each of them took from the traditional women's sphere, the home, while not allowing their work to be limited by that sphere. As her name suggests, Mariana Griswold was born into privilege. Her family was part of New York high society, and she was raised in a grand house on Fifth Avenue. When her family lived for several years in Germany, Mariana had the opportunity to study the work of major intellectuals of the period, including Alexander von Humboldt, Charles Darwin, and Henry David Thoreau. In 1873, she married Schuyler van Rensselaer, a mining and metallurgical engineer from another old New York family, and Mariana gave birth to a son in 1875. Schuyler van Rensselaer died of lung disease in 1884, and a decade later, her son died of tuberculosis. Schuyler van Rensselaer did not approve of his wife's writing, but she persisted, and her career eventually thrived after his death. Van Rensselaer was highly influential in her day. Her book, H.H. Richardson and His Works, helped usher Richardson into the architectural pantheon just 4 years after his death. She was among the first to give him notability. And while Van Rensselaer's language is very formal, her descriptions of Richardson's buildings are expressive and even romantic. The following seems to me an excellent description of the best architecture of any style or period. Quote, "The chief thing which made Richardson's works alike amongst themselves was his power to conceive a building as a whole, and to preserve the integrity of his conception no matter how various might be the features or how profuse the decoration he employed. Each of his best buildings is an organism, an entity, a coherent vital whole. The building seems to have grown, developed, and expanded like a plant. We cannot dismember it in thought without hurting both what we leave and what we take away." I visit so many contemporary buildings that make me think about this relationship of part to whole, that make me wonder why this form, why that slot, what is the point of that curve? It's the job of the critic to ask these questions, of course, but they also indicate a kind of dismemberment in thought that is the failure of a work of architecture to cohere. Many of Van Rensselaer's essays focus on country houses and can be read as offering a counter-narrative to the better-known contemporaneous essays on high-rise architecture by people like Louis Sullivan and Montgomery Schuyler. Van Rensselaer's ultimate purpose in scrutinizing the house was to educate a new generation of clients. Just as Sullivan and Schuyler wanted to improve downtowns, she wanted to improve the neighborhood. Esther McCoy, the architecture critic of mid-century California, made the single-family home a central focus of her writings about Los Angeles as well. Rayner Banham wasn't cowed by many, but even he was nervous about meeting McCoy. When he arrived in Los Angeles in 1965, it was 5 years after the publication of McCoy's 5 California Architects, which gave the contemporary scene a backstory and highlighted the careers of Green and Green, Irving Gill, Bernard Maybach, and R.M. Schindler. As Banham wrote, there was a clarity, a plain-spoken directness about McCoy's writing that to me was engaging as well as informative. But later I discovered that her plain speaking had caused some concerns among our mutual friends. I myself have a bit of a reputation for saying it like it is, acerbic, they call both of us, and the expectation seemed to be that we would try to shred one another conversationally when we met. But when I read Piecing Together Los Angeles, Susan Morgan's collection of McCoy's writings, the dominant emotion I found was actually affection, not acerbic. Of John Lautner's extraordinary houses, which often turn up in movies as villains' lairs, she wrote, "Instead of repose, his houses are thorny with ideas, ideas that wake up the eye and astonish the mind." She's also the first architecture critic I've ever read who, after visiting Robert Venturi's career-making Vanna Venturi house, actually told her readers a little something about his mother, the client. Louis Mumford's 1962 New Yorker review of Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities was poisonously titled Mother Jacobs' Home Remedies. I've always wondered if the cartoon editor was having a bit of fun at Mumford's expense when he placed a cartoon with the line, "So this is the woman behind the man," on the article's opening page. Mumford wrote, "This able woman has used her eyes and even more admirably her heart to essay the human result of large-scale housing." But he mentioned that unfortunately her innocence of easily ascertainable facts is rather frequent, and Mrs. Jacobs is at her best in dealing with small, intimate urban areas. That, in some ways, is a reasonable description of Jane Jacobs' famous depiction of the sidewalk ballet on her stretch of Hudson Street in the West Village, but it discounts how powerful that small to large perspective would turn out to be. Jacobs wrote, "The stretch of Hudson Street where I live is each day the scene of an intricate sidewalk ballet. I make my own first entrance into it a little after 8 when I put out the garbage can, surely a prosaic occupation, but I enjoy my part, my little clang, as the droves of junior high school students walk by the center of the stage dropping candy wrappers. How do they eat so much candy so early in the morning?" But when Mumford wrote disparagingly about Jacobs' heart and her interest in small, intimate urban areas, he completely missed how noticing things like candy wrappers, how taking your children to picket lines, how putting people first can be fundamentals for good criticism. Why does it have to be big to be important? All of these early women critics focused on houses and neighborhoods and intimate areas, but it was only in male critics and historians' eyes that made them lesser. In Anthony Flint's book, Wrestling with Moses, he describes how Jacob marshaled kids, whom she called her little elves, to collect signatures and put up posters because they were catnip for newspaper photographers. Ned Jacobs, then 7, spent his weekend marching around Washington Square wearing a sandwich board that said, "Save the Square." One day when she was shopping for long underwear at Macy's for her sons, Ned and Jim, the clerk asked whether it was for hunting or fishing. "It's for picketing," she replied. And Jacob's daughter Mary is front and center in a June 1958 photograph of a symbolic ribbon tying in front of the Washington Square Arch. And in 1978 interviews, Jacob specifically credited the maternal insight of 2 of her colleagues on the Washington Square picket line. She said, "It was Edith Lyons and Shirley Hayes who wondered why they should be stuck with a road through a park or the widening of the road around it, and why you had to have additional roads for traffic around Washington Square Park at all. And they were considered crazy women who didn't understand the facts of life." When the Wall Street Journal reviewed Death and Life, it put the sentiment more strongly. In another age, the author's enormous intellectual temerity would have ensured her destruction as a witch. All of this language is heavily gendered. Men were trying to literally push Jacobs out of the park, push her out of journalism, push her out of New York City. But who ultimately prevailed? Then and now we see children and their mothers effectively organizing to fight gun violence and police brutality and the ongoing segregation of schools. It isn't witchcraft, it's using the power of image to overcome the power of the establishment. Fearing being discounted, Van Rensselaer, McCoy, Huxtable, and Jacobs rarely discussed being women critics. I had to put together my own confederation of these critical female angels. A rare example of someone else connecting the dots was Esther McCoy's speech accepting the Julia Morgan Award in 1987. She said, "Morgan came out of an earlier age of liberation at the University of California. I stayed once at one of her women's clubs, a faculty club at Berkeley, and I remember marveling at the different kinds of conversations that could be held there, intimate places for 2 or 6 or more. I wondered at the time if women had a special understanding of how people fill space, or was it just Morgan? I think women. Men may see people moving in space, but we see them more easily talking in and grouping up." When I wrote my dissertation on post-war American corporate architecture, including some of the examples of design you see here, I was determined to write about a quote-unquote big topic. I remember thinking, I don't want to write about a topic that's off to the side. I want to write about the center. And that meant skyscrapers and tractors and TV networks and computers. But I realize now that in thinking like that, I had drunk the Kool-Aid of the patriarchy about what was important. I believed that people wouldn't take me seriously unless my dissertation was about the biggest names in architecture history, a history largely organized by men. But as soon as I started doing my research, I found that the way that I had structured the topic as case studies of 4 corporations and as a cross-disciplinary look at graphic design, product design, architecture, and landscape architecture meant that there were far more women and designers of color involved than I had initially thought. I was awake to the possibility of collaboration and teamwork and mutual understanding, and that allowed me to tell a story about corporations that was in the end more in line with my own values than the values of those I was initially trying to imitate. That narrative included women like Florence Knoll, who designed the interiors for Connecticut General so well that architect Gordon Bunshaft created an interiors department at SOM to mimic her style. That included women like Marion Swanee Rand, who ran the in-house design program at IBM for decades, implementing what, quote, curator of corporate character Elliot Noyce and graphic designer had set in place, and outlasting both of their careers. That also included Asian American designers like Isamu Noguchi, who worked with Gordon Bunshaft again and again, adding organic contrast to highly modular buildings and adding richness to our understanding of the skyscraper. When Bunshaft first got in touch with Noguchi in the late 1940s, the sculptor was only a few years out of a Japanese-American internment camp and still struggling to get larger commissions. He would go on to design gardens for Lever House, Connecticut General, Chase Manhattan, and IBM, embedding work that was influenced by privation and racism at the heart of corporate America. The same thing happened when I wrote my most recent book, The Design of Childhood: How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids. I started with a list of important works of architecture for children, featuring many classic male names like Aldo van Eyck, but I soon found many more inventions, most not marked as design, that have made childhood what it is today. And many of those inventions were made by women. Let's talk about Lafayette Park, for example. In the 1950s, the designers and developers of Detroit's Lafayette Park believed that they had thought of everything to make city living as attractive as any suburb. A marquee architect from Chicago, Mies van der Rohe, created an array of housing options, both low and high rise. The sharp-edged volumes were all bound together by landscaped greens in a large public park, romantically named the Plaisance, designed by Alfred Caldwell. The location was minutes from downtown Detroit. There was an adjacent shopping center. But when the first pioneers began moving in, the ground had not yet been broken for the promised Chrysler Elementary School. This is a development designed to attract families. Ruth Ballou, a resident of the Pavilion Apartments, told the Detroit Free Press. If the children were forced to cross busy streets like Gratiot or Congress or Larned to get to existing schools, some parents would balk at moving in. But until enough parents moved in, the school board wouldn't release funds to build the school. So the owners of the development, to save their investment, had to think quickly. And they ended up offering an unoccupied 2-story townhouse to the Detroit Board of Education as a one-room schoolhouse. On the recommendation of neighbors, they hired Ballou, who was a veteran of both the public school system and the Red Cross service during the Second World War, to run that school. So Ballou had to design what the architecture lacked: improvisation. With the summer to cram, she devised a course of study that would work for all 16 pupils, using the city as a classroom and calling on professional parents to fill in the curriculum gaps. "I can't sing," she said, "but we should be able to work something out." Another pioneer akin to Ballou was Caroline Pratt, who in 1913 created the wooden unit blocks that continue to live on the open shelves of almost every kindergarten classroom. She also developed a curriculum based on urban observation, cooperation, and hands-on building that's still in use today at Manhattan City and Country School. It's a man, Friedrich Froebel, the early 19th century German polymath, who's credited with, quote, inventing kindergarten. But it was women, led by the reformer Elizabeth Peabody, who promoted and performed early childhood education in late 19th century America. Froebel himself thought women were better at teaching small children. An early example of gender essentialism that was both helpful in that it created more jobs for women, and hurtful, why only experts on children. These early kindergartens, which were incorporated into the displays at the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, served primarily white and recently arrived immigrant children. A separate set of women brought educational opportunity in new schools to African American youth, often through the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Elizabeth Jennings Graham, known as the school teacher on the streetcar for her refusal to get off a lower Manhattan streetcar reserved for whites, went on to found the first kindergarten in New York for Black children in 1895 on the first floor of her house on West 41st Street. The New York Times wrote, "The children made art. They planted roots and seeds in the garden. Love of the beautiful will be instilled into these youthful minds." Writing my book on childhood allowed me to see these educators in a new light. They were making objects, they were making spaces, they were designing curricula and theorizing childhood. Why weren't they centered in the narrative of education? Design history looks different if you stop defining it via professional organizations and degree programs that kept people out. When I was an undergraduate at Yale, I took Vincent Scully's famous American Architecture History course. My abiding mental image of Vincent Scully is seeing him stand at the front of the Yale Law School auditorium, a great wood-paneled room to which his course, History of Art 112A, had been moved because it had outgrown the spatial resources of the art history department. He stood before us, craggy and tweedy, and beat the screen with a wooden pointer, making the silvery fabric billow. I learned from Scully that you could write about architecture with emotion, and by transforming brickwork into something with heat and heart, pull a broad audience along with you. After his death in 2017, I was asked to write about him for The New Yorker, and I felt I couldn't just say he was a wonderful teacher, he promoted postmodernism, blah, blah, blah. Because at 44, I saw things about him very differently than I did at 19. I had to leave aside the parts I had come to dislike. Scully's embrace of new urbanism as the alternative to urban renewal, his hero worship of Thomas Jefferson and his tendency toward hero worship, period, and even the way he yelled at his projectionist when his slides did not drop. As I read back through Scully profiles, I realized that there was always a story of a slide screw up, and it was always played. But as an undergraduate, my work study job was in the slide collection, and I saw how the older women who worked there jumped and scurried every time he entered the premises. The projectionists, the librarians, his typists, the work study students were all women, And what if we were telling the story and not the butt of the joke? Ultimately, another Yale teacher had a far greater effect on my trajectory, Dolores Hayden. Because she didn't speak in giant auditoriums, and because it wasn't difficult to get into her class, I was all in ignorance about her reputation. But to write about the place of children in cities is to write about the place of women in cities, which led me right back to Hayden's book, The Grand Domestic Revolution, a wonderful and enraging book that underlines the many attempts of women to get out from under housework and isolation in the suburbs and the capitalist structures that wanted to keep them alone in the house doing laundry. Hayden writes about milk bars and communal laundries and community kitchens long before I ever realized those things existed. American cities and suburbs had all of these innovations driven by women at the turn of the last century. These were the real labor-saving devices, not washing machines and stand mixers. But the men in charge didn't see their necessity. There wasn't a permanent architecture developed to support them. And often they were the work of collectives and groups outside the mainstream capitalist system. As with the work of female educators, the question became, how do you put that kind of work in a slideshow? How do you make that into a Wikipedia entry or a board book when there isn't one inventor and when it didn't turn out to be world changing? What is the model for that kind of history? When I first encountered the character Bernadette Fox, I wasn't sure what to think. Fox is the protagonist of Maria Semple's epistolary novel, Where'd You Go, Bernadette, as well as the Cate Blanchett starring movie of the book that came out in 2019. She is a middle-aged female architect who no longer practices. She's the mother of an 8th grader, an unwilling resident of Seattle, and a MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner, married to and TED-talking AI specialist. The only building in Seattle that she likes is the OMA library, which you can see her in this photo. And 2 days before Christmas in the book, she disappears on a cruise to Antarctica. I found this book very hilarious, and it felt so real, except for the Antarctica part. I started to pick at the details. Bernadette Fox knitted through all of her crits. One of her first projects was a pink cherry blossom shaped visitor center for Mount Fuji. Her award-winning house was sourced from materials within a mile radius. Was Bernadette an avatar of thwarted female creativity for her time or for ours? Could she be considered a good role model? I'd say I never considered myself a great architect, Bernadette says late in the movie. I'm more of a creative problem solver with good taste and a soft spot for logistical nightmares. As a woman in architecture who, when I read the book in 2013, had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, the books entwine storylines of motherhood and genius and how women find the space to make something great. Well, I found it hard not to yearn for it a little bit. To me, Bernadette Fox read as wish fulfillment, that a female genius might be recognized in the earliest stages of her career, that she might have the means to not work while she cared for herself after miscarriages and for her sick child after a live birth, that she might be in her mid-40s and on the verge of a second artistic breakthrough. How many women even get their first chance at an artistic breakthrough? As the Guerrilla Girls said with mordant humor, one of the advantages of being a woman artist is, quote, knowing your career might pick up after you are 80. In addition, Bernadette's fictional genius, while derived from traditionally feminine craft and concerned with ecology, still reads as within the Zumthor Pritzker mode of the lone craftsman, a genius of the coast or of the mountains that is in itself a kind of fiction. The Guerrilla Girls made themselves anonymous and presented themselves as a collective as another critique of power. In their guerrilla mask, they couldn't just be slotted in as a token woman in a parade of white and male faces, a lone exception to what looked like a rule. As Los Angeles Times critic Carolina Miranda wrote last fall, The American cult of rugged individualism had proven itself during the pandemic to be toxic, but she also applied this idea to cultural. She wrote, "In some corners of culture, there has been a growing pushback on the idea, a move away from the idea of the lone genius, and a move toward recognizing the more collective ways in which humans work." In a 2018 essay in Curved, architecture critic Alexandra Lange called for an end to the architect profile, noting that in architecture, focusing a story on one person, almost always a man, maintains the fiction that one person does it all. It was a sentiment echoed recently in a story by New York Times food critic Tejal Rao, who wrote that a focus on star chefs erases the contributions of everyone else in the kitchen. June Jordan, the feminist writer, poet, and sometime architect, had called out this tendency decades before in the 1992 essay, Waking Up in the Middle of Some American Dreams. In that essay, she writes of the isolation in which the standard great men worked, the violence of insisting that national security is to be found in body armor rather than through care for the elderly and for the sick, and her seemingly radical vision of the artist as being most successful as a member of a community. Decades earlier, Jordan had collaborated with Buckminster Fuller and Shoji Sadao on a visionary plan, the 1965 skyrise for Harlem that you can see here. This plan sought to reform the neighborhood without displacement by building towers above the existing streets and allowing people to move up into them of their own free will, leaving the ground plane below as open space with ample room for residents' own creativity. She would live to see her own authorship of the plan written out of publications and museum tags, and even in its initial promotion in Esquire magazine, her effort to, quote, contribute to the positive changing of the world was spun as just another form of urban renewal or erasure. In the American Dreams essay, she writes, "Our American worship of space, open road space, frontier space, astral space, and more particularly as much space as possible between me and whoever you are. Our American dreams of the first and the only produce an invariable, mistaken, self-centered perspective that repeatedly proves to be self-defeating and even anti-democratic." So I would say it's the privilege of the critic to rewrite the narrative. We don't have to keep doing it the same old way. You can say, "You may not know me, but I've decided you are my mentor." You can stop writing profiles as if architecture is made by one person and start writing stories of collaboration. You can start collaborating. You can declare an educator a design genius. You can decide that toys are just as important as spaceships. After 2 decades of looking for role models in all the wrong places, I feel like I have stopped waiting around. The people I've inspired by aren't necessarily on the cover of a book, with June Jordan as an exception, but in my group texts and direct messages. When you start asking the right questions, when you go where curiosity takes you, when you do things in your own time, that's when you find not one man or one woman who seems like the successful grown-up you want to be, but a whole chorus of people that are doing work that you want to join. So I want to thank you very much for joining me on this travelogue, and I'm excited to hear what questions you have about my work and how we all might do better work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was very inspiring. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure actually to introduce 2 colleagues of mine who will moderate and go through the Q&A session with you and all of us. This is Julien and Elena, and just give you short ideas. Julien is an architect. He graduated at ENSA Paris-Malaquais and currently pursues a PhD research at the Alice laboratory at EPFL. I hope Alice or Alice. He published in several architectural, philosophical, and anthropological journals, such as Architecture and Culture, and Tabula Rasa. He investigates non-visual epistemologies to thread spatial histories. Bodies, gestures, and words enact and perform specialities implying other forms of historicity concealed by the architectural disciplinarization. Thus, his aim is to replace architectural political agency in gestures themselves, while proposing a critical architectural historiography and theory. And Elena, they founded together with other students' assistants at EPFL, the Drag Lab. Elena Chiavi, she completed her master's in architecture at EPFL Lausanne a few years ago. In her personal projects and workshops, she uses the power of ephemeral architecture to change and thus question our landscape. She enjoys working collaboratively and site-specifically, exploring space and its appropriation through process-based design and construction. Currently, she's working as a teaching assistant here at the studio Tom Emerson at ETH Zurich, and manages the communication for the exhibition space Archizoom at EPFL. So I'm glad to have them here, and I hand over the word to you now.
Thank you, Marie, for the introduction and for organizing the lecture. Thank you also, Alexandra, for sharing with us this fascinating lecture on role models. On behalf of all the organizers of the Parity Talks, we are glad to finish this extremely intense and collaborative day together with you. Today, we have been discussing of a broad range of urgent topics, from institutional activism, critical, intersectional, queer, feminist, post and decolonial perspective on architecture, design and pedagogy, of unlearning, of effective and unpaid labor, of vulnerability and strength, institutional patterns and patterns of domination, of othering and multiplicities of othernesses, and also of drag as an architectural practices. We also have been discussing of taste and taste making, who declares taste, and which power relations the understanding of taste unveiled. But also taste has been challenged in some moments, especially its relevance when trying to understand how to lead institutional change, notably in regards to how higher levels of institution are responding to the question of the day, what's good? That is a high number of publication and successful students with questionable criteria. I think your lecture was extremely insightful on a lot of diverse dimensions that were discussed today, and enable us to go further on and to foresee new pressure points, to use the term that was coined today. We, or at least I, learned a lot on the necessity of finding other ways of writing on architecture and design, and also on how to find other spaces to investigate and other collective practices. Although I think that the question you asked, should we wait to be crowned before acting, is tackling a main issue that we saw emerge several times today, the one of legitimacy, who can speak, and also what is considered as architecture. So I would have a lot of questions to ask about your presentation, but maybe first we would like to open the discussion to the audience. So we invite every one of you to write down your question in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will try to write it chronologically. So I don't know if there is already questions. Elena, I give the word to you.
So please write your questions, and in the meanwhile, maybe I will start by asking you a question, and yeah, I think it's really in relation to maybe the academic freedom that we're all looking for and that was discussed today. And we wanted to ask you, as an architecture critique, do you always feel free to say what you want, or do you maybe had to make concessions in the past? And how do you deal with rewriting history and re-questioning role models?
I would say that, now, after many years, I do generally feel like I get to say what I want, but I definitely have not always done so as in the past. And I completely understand the vulnerability of, younger people, earlier career people, people in academic institutions to not always being able to say what they want to say. And the example, I think in my essay on the end of the architect profile, which I wrote for Curb, and in which I talk about this kind of fiction of the sole creator, I talk a little bit about an architect profile that I had to write about the landscape architect Ada Louise from West 8, and how even as I was writing it, and I believe in that practice, I believe in landscape architecture, etc. Like I could feel myself, in order to cater to my editor, mentioning some of his collaborators less. Like I was anticipating the notes that I would already get from my editor, like, oh, this is too many names, or like, do we need to quote this person, or blah blah blah, etc. And as it happened on that project, a lot of the collaborators were women, because women, throughout history have often been found kind of one step back from the man who's running the firm. Gordon Bunshaft, the mid-century architect, one of his closest collaborators was Natalie Dubois, but her name didn't make it into the articles because she was a senior architect, not the architect in charge. So I would say, I was writing this story, and the whole time I was kind of trying to negotiate my own personal ethics, and whether it was worth it to write essentially the first article about landscape architecture, in the New Yorker, a major mainstream publication, even though I knew that I was leaving some people out. And subsequently to that article, I've had discussions with some of the women that I talked to for the article about how we were both kind of editing ourselves, because we thought that that project was part of a greater good, but on the other hand, we were not telling the story exactly the way that we would have. So I guess I would say that's just an example for me of how even at this point, there are still always negotiations, because editors want things, because you as a writer, want to make a living. And I think, now I have much more power to turn things down. I don't think I would write that profile the same way today as I did 5 years ago, but it is always a negotiation, and it's a privilege to even be able to negotiate.
Thank you for that. So maybe I'll go to a first question from Leonie and Olga. Could you tell us how you became an architectural writer?
I guess I feel like I'm sort of an architecture criticism nerd, in that I already knew about Ada Louise Huxtable when I was in high school. And the possibility of being an architecture critic had already kind of raised itself in my mind when I was, 16, 17, which is quite young, I think. And then I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and Yale has an undergraduate architecture program, but it also has a really, a very old and august student newspaper, the Yale Daily News. So I was an architecture major, and then I was also the arts editor at the newspaper. So I was already kind of thinking about these two tracks for my mind, kind of being an architect and actually making studio projects, and learning about journalism. And I think the fact that I went to a university that was able to support both of those equally was really important, and really important for my development, because I got to read a lot of writers that I refer to all the time in my work. And so then when I graduated, I went to New York and got a job at a magazine, and already kind of understood what needed to be done to become a cultural writer. So I felt like I had this kind of two-track mind really from a pretty early age.
Thank you for this answer. We had another answer about your path, but I think you already partly answered to the question of Cara Rachele, that was what drew you to criticism as opposed to architectural history?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was that experience working for my college newspaper, and then working for, New York Magazine when I was in my early 20s in New York. I saw that there were critics that could speak both to the profession and to this really wide audience. And honestly, like I've always been really enthralled by pop culture. I think you can see that turn up in a lot of my work. And so the idea that I could write about architecture in this pop way and not just be speaking within the academy has always been super important to me. And that just really is based on my own interests, like not wanting to limit myself to a certain kind of dialogue and to a certain kind of reading. I would also say I never really liked reading theory that much. And I felt like, oh, if I become, an architectural journalist, I don't ever have to like try to wade through theory again. I know some people love it, but I did not like it. And it felt like I could free myself from that burden if I became more of like a pop architecture critic.
Another question and comment from Sabine von Fischer. Thank you, Alexandra, for sharing your ideas and work. I enjoyed listening. Writing per se seems a solitary act in general. Thus, can you say something about writing collaboratively as co-authors or in dialogue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's true. Most of my writing is solitary, but I feel like every year or two, I start to feel like it's too solitary. And I want to, do a project with other people. I get this itch to collaborate. It's like I'm tired of the inside of my own mind. And in the past, that's manifested itself in a couple of different ways. For several years, I and my friend Mark Lamster, who's also an architecture critic, now in Texas, did this thing called Lunch with the Critics, where we would go and visit a new building and then send emails back and forth for an afternoon, like kind of reviewing it in dialogue. And that was really fun. And I'm sad I don't get to do it anymore. 2 years ago, I pitched one of my articles to the Los Angeles public television station, KCET, as a documentary subject, and ended up co-writing that the script for the documentary and working with the director and producers to turn, essentially a piece of criticism into an hour-long documentary on the experiences of Japanese American designers in internment camps. And I would say, like right now, I would really love to have a podcast, basically about like pop culture and design. And last spring, I was working on that with a friend of mine. So again, a collaboration, and then we started looking for a producer, and then he got a great new job. So that is kind of on hold, but it's something I do hope to return to. So I guess the point of that is, sometimes it means writing in a different way, but also exploring, different forms of criticism, or criticism in different media can give you the opportunity to collaborate.
Maybe before answering the next question, I'm quite interested to hear a bit more of what you feel about the new formats that are possible to discuss and to also critique, because I feel there's a lot of emerging podcasts and also other medias that permit to exchange differently information in a more direct way, where maybe the thoughts are less canalized and rethought. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the rise of video, and then like in American media right now, the biggest thing is probably the rise of podcasts, is a great opportunity to talk about architecture and design in a different and yes, sort of less edited, less precious format. That I've been on the podcast 99% Invisible about 5 times. They don't pitch themselves as a design podcast, but they often end up covering these topics. And I love doing that. And that's what kind of gave me the idea to do my own podcast. But it's interesting, something like 99% Invisible is a very produced, edited, sort of complete podcast. And the one I want to do is really more of a dialogue, like a chatty podcast, because I feel like architecture and design are in a lot of ways being squeezed out of media, and unless we can kind of capture new audiences, younger audiences, there isn't going to be enough of a market for major publications to keep having critics. And I feel like something like a chatty podcast on, pop culture and design is the kind of thing that I think could, get people that don't realize they're interested in it back into it. Like, we really need to loosen up the formats in which we talk about these topics and make sure people can find information kind of wherever they are, however they like to consume media.
Thank you for this answer. We have another question of Beatrice Klettner-Soller. I hope I told it right. I particularly enjoyed the sarcastic poster of facts about the perks of being a woman professional. I was wondering if you could contrast it with an honest opinion on where the main problems lie in the relation of women and men, both being part of the same professional field.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're referring to the Guerrilla Girls poster, and the Guerrilla Girls are an arts collective, and that is actually that poster is, I think, from the 80s. I should have written down the date of it. So one of the ironies of that poster for me is that it still completely tracks for today. Like, I don't know if you realize that it was that old, but unfortunately, like, not enough has changed to make it outdated. And actually, I mean, and the way they formatted it works really well for the internet. Like, you can post, it looks to me like some of the things that people post on Instagram now, kind of like political, like, designed posters on Instagram, like, it just reads in that really quick way. My honest opinion on where the main problems lie, that though is a really big question. I think it does come back to the questions that it sounds like you guys were talking about all day, a little bit about who is judging you and how you allow yourself to be judged. People talk a lot about imposter syndrome, meaning feeling as if you don't have the right to be in the spaces that you're in, that you don't know enough to speak up, etc. And I think the only way to overcome that is to find supports within your community, find people that do, see your skills. I mean, when I talked about needing to kind of make up Ada Louise Huxtable as a mentor, I think like that's the same impulse. Like, I didn't find what I needed in my professional field. So I, kind of made up some fictional narratives for myself. I took a sideways step. I was working in a magazine. I went back to school to learn more, to get over my own imposter syndrome. I mean, so ultimately, like, it's a little bit of therapeutic language. Like, you have to work on yourself. But I think hearing people talk out loud about their struggles, reading stories of, how other people have felt imposter syndrome can help get around some of the entrenched sort of institutional powers that may discount like what you as a woman, what you as a young person, what you as a person of color want to say.
So maybe I follow with a comment. Clubhouse is a great format for chatty podcasts from Selma.
Yeah. I have not joined Clubhouse yet, but I have some friends and colleagues that have joined it and have been using it that way. So maybe I should pay more attention and check out what they're doing.
And then she continued and asked you, there is a say that critiques are the biggest optimists. Did you encounter a direct effect of change from a critique that you wrote?
That's a hard question. I would agree that critics are optimists. I always describe myself as kind of a utopian thinker. Like, I wouldn't do this if I didn't think things couldn't get better, right? And I think that's something that people often misunderstand about criticism. They see it as coming from a negative place, but I see myself as trying to make architecture and by extension cities, the world, a better place. So yeah, it's definitely done with a spirit of optimism. I'm trying to think. I feel like I don't think I can point to a specific piece of criticism that like changed something. I think over time, I have to believe that I've been able to change the dialogue around things. You know, one of the last pieces I wrote before the pandemic in like, I guess it was December 2019, was about the disappointments of architecture in New York of 2019, the vessel, you know, Thomas Heatherwick's, you know, stair sculpture at Hudson Yards, and also a new library by Stephen Hall in Queens that had some major accessibility problems. And in both cases, it was that I felt that the architects hadn't thought about access for all, you know, people with disabilities, and they hadn't thought about how their architecture could really serve the public. And you know, subsequently, there have been, you know, many more critiques along those lines. There's ongoing critique of the vessel. And so sometimes I feel like what the critic does is to identify a feeling that a lot of people are having and, you know, give them a place to put those feelings. And then seeing, you know, a piece like that, or my piece on the end of the architect profile, like picked up and repeated by other people, makes me feel like something is changing in the culture, and that, you know, like my words will have contributed to that.
We have another comment and question from Leonie and Olga. Thanks again for this interesting conversation. Where do you think the focus on one-person role models comes from? Do you think academia addresses this issue? Or how do you feel we could move our focus towards collectives rather than individuals?
Well, one-person role models is easier, right? It's like, it's one name, it's one person's picture. It's kind of collapsing the whole like complicated narrative of like authorship and work and labor into one person that then you can hold up and like tell a much simpler story about. So, you know, I think it, you know, it comes from fiction in the real sense, in that that's the way stories are told in storybooks. And then we apply that as a kind of shorthand to real history, because people already understand that, and it kind of goes down easier. That said, you know, like, I don't think most of us would go into academia if we wanted things to be easy. So I think, you know, moving the narrative towards collectives rather than individuals involves, you know, framing projects differently. It involves, you know, picking subjects that are likely to turn up the kind of archival information that, you know, that allows you to like expand on those collectives. It's a reframing. It's kind of taking your academic work and looking for a different model. I think that, in fact, like looking to histories of education for me rather than histories of architecture ended up being really helpful, because education talks about schools and schools talk about principals and teachers. And so there's more of a built-in sense of the collective and sense of many people contributing to a curriculum that exists in, you know, histories of education as opposed to histories of architecture. So I think it's all about kind of finding models elsewhere and how to framing your topics differently. As I mentioned, like, I didn't go into my dissertation thinking that I was going to turn up all like women and BIPOC architects, but it did, because I had already framed it as this kind of concert of different forms of design. And that, it turned out, like, was an effective way to kind of break down what had become a very like heroicizing, like, men on top, architecture on top narrative of the post-war, you know, skyscraper period.
I maybe still have a question to ask you. I was wondering also, as a critique, if you work with other women critique, and do you have like a network of people that you can rely on and you can really discuss? Because I feel it's always hard to make it happen at the start, and maybe also keep it in the long term. So I was wondering how if you do work collectively, and you have this network that surrounds you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, I've been lucky to have some great colleagues. You know, as a journalist, you bounce around from, you know, website to website, etc. But I feel like I've picked up a lot of great colleagues along the way. At Curbed, my editor, Kelsey Keith, was a terrific person to bounce ideas off of. And I met Alyssa Walker, who is an urban critic, and she and I still, you know, basically like text once a week, send each other like funny Twitter things, make fun of people. Like there's a lot of back chatter. I'm also really good friends with Amanda Hurley, who wrote the Radical Suburbs book that I had on one of my slides. She's an editor at Bloomberg Business Week, but I worked with her a few times at her former job. And so she and I talk a lot about suburbs and like changing the narratives around women in the post-war period in the US. Carolina Miranda, who I also quoted, works for the LA Times, and she's been a friend and colleague that I, you know, send ideas back and forth with for a long time. Mark Lampster, who I also mentioned, who's the critic for the Dallas Morning News. We used to be neighbors and did that lunch with the critics together, and we've kept up the dialogue. So, I mean, like, one of the joys of the internet is that you can maintain friendships with people even though they don't live in the same city as you. And given how few architecture critics there are in the US, the fact that there is this kind of like underlying network of all of us, that we don't live near each other anymore, but we're able through, you know, Twitter and emails and texts and everything to keep in touch is incredibly helpful.
Marie, please.
Okay. I would have a question, you know, just to continue with this marathon. Maybe you want some water? I mean, this is immense what you're doing here. It's a pause.
Okay. No, all right, thanks.
My question, actually today we have been also talking about the canon. So the canon in education and canon in teaching. I myself, I studied literature, so I know a lot about discussions of the canonized literature. So when you're teaching yourself, how do you deconstruct, reconstruct, or extend the canon yourself? Or have you realized already that there have been changes in the canon when teaching architecture criticism or architecture history? You mentioned a very interesting writers today, so I wrote them down. I don't know, are they already in the process of being canonized or added, or, you know, I don't know. I would be very interested in your position on that.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't taught in a number of years, and one of the things that I would want to do the next time I teach architecture criticism is completely rewrite my syllabus. I mean, it's actually one of the things like keeping me from teaching architecture criticism again, because I know it would be a tremendous amount of work, because I already know, you know, my book on criticism, which I wrote, I guess it's 10 years ago now, like, is a very white book. And if I were writing that book today, I would think much harder about intersectionality and other critics that I might be able to include in my discussions, because I feel badly about that. I feel like, you know, it's not up to date in some ways. And I'm happy to see people who are using it in courses in architecture schools for criticism have added lots of new critics, you know, to their syllabus. Like, they're doing some of the work that I didn't do, and I would learn in turn from them the next time I teach criticism. And someone like June Jordan, who I discovered relatively recently, but has been written about, I think, in a number of places in the last few years. Like, she's somebody that I would absolutely want to add to the syllabus. So I guess I feel like, luckily, I am friends with a lot of younger people in academia, and they've already been working on this problem. And I feel like when I teach again, I will go to them and look for their expertise. And a lot of them also share their syllabi online. So yeah, I think this is a project that I would say, you know, scholars, you know, under 45 are already working on. And I'm glad that the syllabi that I was taught with in the 1990s are largely outdated, but I realize sometimes that, you know, I did a lot of I did more reading in the architectural canon when I was an undergrad and when I was in graduate school. And now that's 15 years ago. So there's a gap in my knowledge that I try to fill in. And I mostly do it kind of from, not in a general sense, but like from topic to topic. Like when I was writing about childhood, I went and looked for books about, you know, racial segregation in the suburbs and people writing more about like the different experiences of children in education depending on their race. So I'll go looking for a more diverse literature, a more diverse canon kind of by the topic that I'm working on rather than in a general sense. And that means that, yeah, like now I have a bibliography that I could share on those topics. But there's still like many holes to fit in just of kind of the change in scholarship and the change of politics that have happened over the past 15 years.
I would also, please, Elena, go.
No, you go.
I would have also a question. In this afternoon, in the second roundtable, one of the biggest question was how to mess things up and where to start. And I also wanted to ask you, like, to which extent the critic, the architectural criticism can mess things up, and where would you start also from that point?
Well, I think, I mean, in some ways, like the essay is the easiest place to start, especially if you're, you know, kind of writing it initially for yourself or within the context of the class. Like your professor might present you with a topic or present you with a building that's the topic, but you can take that in any direction that you want. You can turn the question on its head, and you know, the good thing about writing is like the resources to turn a question on its head are completely inexpensive. I mean, like one of the things I love best about writing is like I can just do it by myself. It doesn't cost anything. I don't need to learn any new skills. And I think that like it's important to like use that wisely and to eat like in all of your choices, like mess things up by trying to identify like what for you is the most important question to ask, like within a given prompt. I mean, after that, you know, like after you've written, that's when it gets into questions of like, do you want to be published? Who will publish? Will they accept this? And that can be more complicated. But I mean, one good thing about the internet is that you can always publish it yourself. And I do think there are a lot of really good journals now that are publishing like super interesting work. I really like the Avery Review, which is published online by Columbia. Like in my book on shopping malls that I'm working on now, I quote, you know, 3 or 4 pieces from there that are younger scholars asking really great questions that I never would have thought to ask.
So I think we have been covering all the questions that were asked, and we're really happy that you were able to answer them all. And maybe Marie, you want to say a last word to Alexandra and to the public?
My last word. Yes, I want to say thank you, of course. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the audiences, and thank you, Alexandra, that you have been so engaged in this lecture, and you had the time. So I appreciate your thoughts sharing with us, and I hope we stay in touch and we read a lot from you, and maybe we will meet in person someday. I'm still looking forward to these times. So for me, this was a dense day, a very interesting day, and an interesting and inspiring lecture also at the very end of this day. And I say thank you and I give you the word. And I'm, I think I will keep on discussing for a lot of days and weeks and months. So this is not the end of the day and the parity talks. This is just the beginning. This is my word. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you all for having me and for the great questions.
And thank you, Julien. So I will maybe try to close this day. And I hope you will still be awake for a few more minutes. So dear fellow creatures, as Katharina Bonnevier said, dear guests, speakers, audience, students and staff, dear professors, colleagues and friends, dear fellow parity comrades, I am both thrilled and actually scared to conclude today's event, because while joining me at my first parity talks last semester, co-organizing the workshop Network of Solidarity with Charlotte Malterbart, Juliette Martin and Senta Farlander, I would have actually never imagined that we would manage to join forces a few months later with 4 other activist groups to ask ourselves collectively what's good. I would really like to thank ourselves for hinting towards this coordinated action and hopefully a common planetary curriculum. As we all live together in a worldwide multiscalar and complex crisis, standing at a turning historical point, what could have been better than sharing our common knowledge digitally to push forward the conversation on gender, equity, inclusion, and belonging? We all experience throughout the day that by taking part actively in this debate within our architectural communities, we manage to raise fundamental questions that touch the very foundation of our modern society. So again, what's good today? Is it enough to use unconventional ways of presenting, communicating our ideas? Or, as Cruz and Natalie said, to be solidarian present at all times as activists in the public space and not only in our architectural practices and institutions? Or as Athena also clearly stated, do we really need to take the time to deconstruct our systems of values? Today's lectures and discussion have only proven how many deeply inspiring and generous people are fighting for architecture to become an inclusive discipline and a radical practice that addresses the needs of all and the struggles of many, listening to the voices of those who suffer constant discrimination because of their gender, sexual identity, race, class, religion, disability, or physical appearance. And I would like to state what Eric Robsky-Hunter said early on. Our agenda is really to shake up academia as long as we can, to be politically active and to stop contributing to the wrong culture. Let's make our institution the good testing grounds where architecture can stay fluid and propose metamorphosis in the long term. So with these closing words and speaking on behalf of the Parity Group, Women in Design, Claiming Spaces, the Drag Lab, the Parity Board, and the Parity Front, I would like to invite us all to reflect, comment, share, and act further in the following hours, days, months. Our multiple, and on the mirror board, our multiple communication channels and inside our community. And I think we would all be delighted to grow in members and to continue the many dialogues we have just started together today, as Maryse just said. We also wish to reiterate that you are free to join all our groups, that the platforms we create are open sourced, and that you can contact us at any time. So please consider joining the events planned in the following weeks and months, and come and join our Parity season. A huge thank you to the Parity Group members, especially to Amy and Benjamin, as well as the Parity Front and Charlotte for supporting us during the past few months, and to all 4 involved institutions for their support, and of course, our speakers, moderators, and participants. And now I wish you all a wonderful rest after this active day, and a million thanks for your enormous and generous energy. Have a great evening. Thank you.